practical thing that you may have noticed if you didn't already. As I mentioned earlier in the year, we're doing pictures for our bulletin board so that all the members of the RCIA will be out there, the RCIA team. So if you didn't have a chance to get your picture taken, we'll do some at the break, and Cody will be in charge of that, so we'll do that over here. So if you want to catch in at the break, if for some reason you're not able, or your sponsor isn't here this week, we're going to do makeup next week. So makeup pictures time next week. As I mentioned last week as well, you're in for a special treat tonight as we enter into the next 2 weeks, breaking apart the history of the Catholic Church, the church history. And so to do that, we have Dr. David Stone, who is a professor here at K-State in the history department, and he's going to bless us. He's a very talented and gifted professor, so excited to have him here.
All right. Well, before I begin, there's one important thing I have to say. Is the red light supposed to be on when I turn on the mic? Because it's not.
It's not.
It's not.
Not supposed to be.
Not supposed to be on. Okay, cool. All right, then we're good. All right, it's great to see you all here. Thank you for coming. I'm glad to be here. I asked about the battery because last year I gave this lecture and forgot to turn on my mic, and so there was an hour and a half of me standing up here and moving my arms around and nothing. So I'm glad that we got the mic worked out. My goal tonight is to talk about the history of the Catholic Church. We're going to be doing essentially from the beginnings of the Church up to the year 500 tonight. We'll do 500 through the Protestant Reformation next week to give you a sense of what the Church is and where it came from. And one of the important things that I want to try to do in this is do some apologetics. And this is not apologetics in the sense of apology, of saying you're sorry. This is a very specific meaning of apologetics. Some of you may be familiar with that, especially because Father Jarrett's running some classes on apologetics. But apologetics in this context is explaining and defending the faith against misunderstanding and attack. And there's lots of different ways of doing apologetics. You can do apologetics that are based on the Bible. You can do apologetics based on logic and theology. I want to talk about historical apologetics because I think there are often questions that people have about the Catholic faith to which there are historical answers, that understanding the history of the Church helps to make sense of why the Church is what it is and why it does what it does. And so since this is RCIA, many of you are coming from different traditions. You may have these questions from your friends and relatives. You may have these questions yourselves. And so what I'm hoping is, as I talk about the history of the Church, to bring up and then deal with some of these questions that people may have about what Catholicism is and where it came from. To start, and one other thing, I'll break for questions at various points. If at any point you're completely lost, feel free to raise a hand. I'll also pause for questions, and at the end we'll have a chance for questions. I love questions. As Father Jarrett said, I'm a professor, so I love to go off on tangents, and it's questions that let me do that. So very much I encourage you to get me off track. That would be great. I want to start off talking about two kinds of context for the Catholic Church and where it comes from, where Christianity arises. And the first one has to do with the Roman context, the Roman Empire into which Jesus is born, and where Christianity first spreads. Now, the Roman Empire, by the time of Jesus, has spread to encompass, from what the Roman point of view, is the entire civilized world. There were actually civilized places outside of Rome, but there weren't a lot of them. Rome is dominating Europe. And the places in Europe that aren't part of Rome don't really matter. People there are poor, ignorant, there's just nothing there. Rome dominates the world. But the Roman Empire provides a space into which Christianity can expand. There are very specific things about the Roman Empire that make it possible for Christianity to expand. Among them are common languages. In the western half of the Roman Empire, they speak Latin. In the eastern half of the Roman Empire, they speak Greek. Educated people are going to know both those languages, and so people can carry the message with common languages all throughout the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire also provides basic security. There's a network of roads that connect the empire. Those roads are safe. There aren't pirates on the seas. People can travel by sea. It's easy to get around. And so if you read the book of Acts, which tells the story of the early church, and let me just say, if you want to do a follow-up to what I talk about tonight, by far the best thing you can do is go back and reread the book of Acts carefully and look at it and think about it, because that's telling the story of what's going on. The stuff I'm talking about tonight is the same stuff that's in the book of Acts. That's what you should go back and take a look at. But the disciples of Jesus, Paul and the other apostles, are constantly bouncing all over the Mediterranean. They're going everywhere. And they can do that because the Roman Empire makes it safe and easy to travel. So that context is very important for the spread of early Christianity. But there's another context to talk about in Rome, and that's ancient religion, the religion of the Romans. And that religion we can call by a couple names, paganism and polytheism. Paganism today often sounds pejorative, like it's intended to be negative. And it's really not meant to be negative, it's just descriptive. Paganism is a neutral term describing the religion of ancient peoples. Polytheism means the same thing. And these are religions of many gods. Polytheism just means many gods. And so if you're familiar with Greek mythology or Norse mythology, you've got a grasp on polytheism. There's a god of the sun, there's a god of the moon, there's a god of thunder, there's a god of war, there's a god of the sea, there's a god of the dead. Everything has a god. And in addition to those major gods, you've got little gods. A lake can have a god, and a mountain can have a god, and a river can have a god, and a city can have a god. Everything has got a god. And that makes, and ancient religions all tend to work that way, and so that makes them kind of portable. From the Roman point of view, if the Romans conquer a place, they show up and they conquer somebody, and they say, oh, well, you've got a sky god. Your sky god is kind of like our sky god, Jupiter. And your war god is kind of like our war god, Mars. And so it's easy for people to move around the ancient world and recognize polytheistic faiths that look kind of like their own, that just have gods for everything. Now, there's a couple drawbacks to ancient religion in terms of the way that people are living their lives and the questions that they're facing as they live. Ancient religion is really based on what you do, and not what you do in terms of the morality of what you do, but of carrying out the proper rituals. And I forgot last night, and I'm forgetting tonight, I have handouts. Let me go ahead and start passing those out. This will help things out. Ancient religion is a ritual. Perform the proper ritual. The gods really don't care, and Geneva, there's also a stack on the table over there. The ancient gods under polytheism don't care how you behave. Your morality doesn't matter. The one thing the Greek gods didn't want you to do was murder your parents. If you murdered your parents, they got mad. Other than that, it just doesn't matter. What the gods want from you is sacrifice. Ancient religion is essentially about making a sacrifice. And so on this vase, you see, this is a pagan religious ceremony. There's a sacrificial block, a priest is washing his hands, and this is the sheep that's the unlucky guest. So under ancient religion, you slaughter an animal, you pour out some wine, you do something to sacrifice. And you sacrifice to make the gods happy so the gods don't kill you. In the ancient world, what you want more than anything else is for the gods to leave you alone. Because if the gods don't leave you alone, bad things are going to happen. If the gods are upset with you about something, they can cause disease, they can cause your crops to fail, lightning can strike. So ancient religion is about paying off the gods through sacrifice so they don't do bad things to you. So it's not about what you believe. It's not about the morality of your behavior. It's not about the actions you carry out with other human beings. It's just whether you carry out the proper sacrifices in the proper ways. But this leaves lots of people in the ancient world unsatisfied. This sort of religion seems to be, there's something lacking here. It doesn't provide guidance in how you're supposed to live your life. Sophisticated people in the ancient world, philosophers, those who have an education, start to think to themselves, does it really make sense that there are thousands of these all-powerful beings? How can there be thousands of beings, all of which are all-powerful? It just doesn't make any sense. So people are trying to find some way of dealing with and understanding their world when they're finding this sort of ancient polytheism not really answering the questions they have. Now, one answer that people are coming up with right before the time that Jesus is born is what are called mystery cults. And to use a very rough analogy, a mystery cult is kind of like a fraternity that gets you into heaven. It's like a fraternity that's a secret society. It has an initiation ritual. Not everybody can join, only a very select few. And when you learn secret words and secret handshakes and secret rituals that are promising you to get into heaven through the agency of a particular god. So a mystery cult is dedicated to one god out of the thousands of gods, and that they claim they've got this secret knowledge that will grant you all sorts of good things in life. Now, these are very popular because they seem to promise a lot of things. You know, they're going to promise success in life. They're going to promise a sort of good life after death. But they also seem somehow unsatisfying. There are lots of questions they don't answer. They don't say anything about how you're supposed to treat other people. They don't say anything about how you're supposed to live your life. They don't deal with the problem of these thousands of all-powerful gods. They just pick one god that they're going to bribe. They don't deal with the all they do is essentially say to a very tiny little group, if you say the right magic words, everything's going to be fine. This also leaves people a little bit cold. Another way of trying to deal with questions of life is looking at philosophy. So ancient philosophers who find these stories and myths of the gods a little ridiculous try to come up with other ways of understanding their world and other ways of dealing with life. And there's two big schools of philosophy at the time that Jesus is born that are worth talking about. One is the Stoics. The Stoics and the Epicureans have very different pictures of the universe, but they add up in many ways to the same thing. To the Stoics, everything is fated, everything is inevitable. The world will be what it is going to be. So we have no control over our lives. Our outcomes, what's going to happen to us, is fate. It's already set. It's out of our control. And so the only way to deal with that from the Stoic point of view is just accept it. Bad things will happen to us. We'll eventually die. That's all there is. We might as well just live with it. And if you're sufficiently philosophical, this can be kind of a comfort, but as you can see, it's not the most sort of uplifting ways of living and dealing with the world. The Epicureans kind of take the opposite tack. From the Epicurean point of view, everything's random. Everything in the universe is random. We don't have much control over everything. The only thing we can control is enjoying what we can out of life. Now, the Epicureans get bad press because everybody thinks that Epicureanism means sort of wine and women and carousing and all this stuff. And that's not what the Epicureans are about. When they talk about enjoying life, they mean time with friends, beauty of nature. They're thinking in a little more elevated way. But still, it seems to be sort of inadequate. It's just enjoy life until you die, and that's it. So this is the context for the ancient world. There's a lot of things about ancient religion that are leaving people somehow feeling incomplete. Okay, let me pause. Questions on anything so far? Okay. Now, this is the Greek and Roman context, sort of ancient civilizations under the Roman Empire. There's another context, and that's the Jewish context. Jesus obviously was Jewish. He was born a Jew into a Jewish environment, and that Jewish context is important as well. So, to talk about Judaism in the ancient world, the Jews in the ancient world are seen as, by outsiders, as weird. They see themselves as weird, in that they are very much unlike that picture of ancient religion that I was talking to you about. The way the Jews think about God and the way the Jews live their lives, everyone around them recognizes as being distinct and unusual. And the Jews themselves think that they are distinct and unusual. Now, what makes the Jews unusual? First of all, for the Jews, there is one God, only one God. It's not like there's thousands of gods and the Jews just pick one to worship. The Jews say there are no other gods. There is one God and only one God. And that puts them fundamentally at odds with all other faiths in the ancient world. The other thing the Jews say that makes them unusual, that makes them weird in the ancient world, is that the Jews say that this one God cares how you live your life. That the way you treat people matters to God. God just doesn't want to be bought off. God cares about whether you treat people in the right way, that you deal with people justly. And those two things, again, are extraordinarily unusual. We don't think of them as strange. They're natural to us as Christians, as Catholics, but they're very strange in the ancient world. Now, the Jews still practice sacrifice. Sacrifice is still part of their religion. So that's one thing that ties Jews into other parts of ancient religion, is they do make sacrifices. And what you see here, this is not a photograph. This building no longer exists. It's a reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. This is Herod's temple. So this is the temple that existed in Jerusalem that was the center of the Jewish faith. You may have heard of the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. The Wailing Wall is essentially the back wall of this platform. This temple, you may have heard of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount is really a temple mound. It's this big raised platform. And so the platform is still there. The temple is gone. The platform is still there. And the Wailing Wall is a surviving wall of this structure on what's the backside here. But the temple, what was the temple used for? Essentially, the temple was a place for sacrifice. This is where observant Jews would go to sacrifice to God. And you can see from the picture, the kind of computer image, that this is kind of nested courtyards. There's this very big courtyard here, and then smaller courtyards going into the Holy of Holies. The Holy of Holies is the most sacred place in the temple. Only the Jewish high priest can enter that building, and only once a year on the Day of Atonement. So there's this nested set of courtyards. And to sacrifice, you would bring special sacrificial animals into the temple to be sacrificed. And this worked just fine. It was perfectly normal for the Jews when all the Jews lived within a couple days of Jerusalem. Because this is the one place that you can do sacrifices. You don't do sacrifices at other places. You sacrifice at the temple. The temple in Jerusalem is the heart of the religion. And so if you live within a few days' walk of Jerusalem, that's okay. Once a year, twice a year, at festivals, you can go into the city, attend the sacrifices, and then go back home. But one of the things that's happening to the Jews in this period of time, at about sort of the turn of the millennium, about the time that Jesus is born, is that the Jews are spreading out around the Roman Empire. This is the diaspora. They're spreading out. And if Jews are no longer living around Jerusalem, they have to find some way of carrying out their faith that isn't about sacrificing at the temple, because they can no longer do that. They're not living there. And so Jews that are living away from the temple, in the diaspora and other parts of the Roman Empire, start to develop a different kind of religious worship. And so what they do in places called synagogues are have communal services that don't involve sacrifice. You only sacrifice at the temple. So in a synagogue, somewhere else in the Roman Empire, Jews would gather, they would read from Holy Scripture, they would hear a lesson about Holy Scripture, they would pray communally. Now that should sound familiar because in its essence, that's what a Christian worship ceremony is. What we do at church on a Sunday is a direct outgrowth of what the Jews did in the synagogues. Not in the temple, but in the synagogues. As the Jews spread out, they develop a different sort of service that's not about sacrifice. Christians take that from the Jews and develop it on their own. Okay. And so this new form of Judaism that's carried out at synagogues is no longer led by priests. It's priests who do sacrifices. The people who lead synagogues are teachers, rabbis, and so we call Rabbinic Judaism the faith of the Jews who are living out in the diaspora away from Jerusalem in synagogues carrying out sacrifices. And so all the Judaism that exists today is Rabbinic Judaism. The temple is destroyed shortly after Jesus is crucified. The temple is gone. There's no more temple sacrifices. The only way to be a Jew is to be a Jew at a synagogue with a rabbi. Okay. So far, so good. Questions on anything so far? Yes?
Was there some kind of regular service or something before Jesus was?
Yes. I mean, essentially, if you think about in Jesus' life, Jesus goes to Jerusalem for Passover. And Passover is a time when more or less every Jew who can physically do it comes to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem gets really big at Passover. So all the Jews come to the temple. There's other festivals in the Jewish calendar. I mean, Passover's the big one, but there's other ones. And so essentially the rhythm of the year is there are these big festivals at which thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people will come into Jerusalem to observe these particular high holidays. And it's actually the time of year, the Jewish high holidays are right around this time of year. So Yom Kippur is coming up and Rosh Hashanah. There's a whole lot of Jewish holidays that are this time of the fall. It's one of the reasons the Romans are so nervous when Jesus shows up in Jerusalem, is because, and I'm going to talk about Messiahs in just a little bit, but it's not just that Jesus shows up and everybody is kind of flocking to him, but he's showing up when there's 250,000 other Jews who aren't normally in the city who have shown up as well. It's the height of the religious year for the Jews. The Romans get a little bit nervous. And so why do they get nervous? That's where we're going to go next. Yes?
Did the Romans destroy the temple?
Yes. One of the things about the Jews, and I'll just bring up this next slide, is this, the problem, from the Roman point of view, the problem of the Messiah. The Jews have this idea from the prophets that there will come a Messiah. And Messiah just means anointed one, someone who's been anointed. So the next question is, well, who gets anointed? Big answer is kings are anointed. And so the Jewish concept is, from the Hebrew prophets, is that sometime in the future, there will be a Messiah, a king, who will come and free the Jews. The Jews are living under Roman domination. They don't like it. Their sense is, from their prophets, there will come a king who will destroy the Romans and create a new kingdom for the Jews, where the Jews will be free out from underneath the Romans and everybody else who's been oppressing them, where the Jews will be free. And so the picture in Jewish religion of the Messiah is someone who will come and destroy, who will lead a war. The Messiah will be a warrior king who will destroy the enemies of the Jews and restore the Jewish kingdom. And so anytime there's any sense that there's a Messiah floating around, the Romans get very nervous because that means the Jews are going to start a rebellion. And just to get to the question, what happens is every 10 or 20 years, somebody shows up claiming to be a Messiah, leads a rebellion against the Romans, and the Romans have to slaughter a bunch of people. And in the year 70, there's a really big rebellion against, this is sort of 35 years after the crucifixion, there's a really big rebellion. The Romans come in, crush the Jews, and empty Jerusalem. The temple is burned down. The Romans evacuate the Jews from Jerusalem, and so the only way to be a Jew is, again, outside in the synagogues, because Jerusalem's empty now. No more Jews there. So from the Roman point of view, again, the reason they're nervous when Jesus shows up in Jerusalem is these messiahs keep popping out of the woodwork and leading rebellions. Now, there's another implication to this, and you see this in the New Testament. People are very puzzled by Jesus because they see him as a Messiah, but he doesn't act like a Messiah. From their point of view, a Messiah should pick up a club and start beating up on the Romans. And Jesus isn't doing that. He keeps sort of confounding them. His apostles don't get this. The apostles keep asking him, sort of, what are you doing? Like, when does the killing start? When do we get to slaughter the Romans? And that's just not what's happening. And so it's very, very, you can sort of see in the New Testament, Jesus' own followers are puzzled by this. They don't quite get what's going on, because Jesus they see as a Messiah, but he's not acting like they expect a Messiah to act. You know, messiahs who show up and lead a rebellion are a dime a dozen. That's happened lots and lots of times before Jesus and lots of times after. One that doesn't lead a rebellion, that's unusual. And it's one of the reasons why people are so surprised by Jesus and puzzled by what he's trying to tell them. Okay, so we're good so far? All right, so this is the context into which Jesus is born. And I'm actually not going to say very much about the actual life of Jesus and mission, because, I mean, I have a sense, just guessing here, that in RCIA you're going to talk once or twice about Jesus over the rest of the semester. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about him tonight. I'm kind of skipping over the life of Jesus. We'll leave that to other nights. And kind of talk about the church that comes to exist after the crucifixion and the resurrection. So what is the church that grows up? Okay. So one of the things to talk about in terms of Messiah, and this is the first of the apologetic points I want to bring up, one of the questions that you often hear, and this is not just a Catholic question, a question to Catholics, it's a question to Christians in general. People may say, well, yes, Jesus taught a very good message. We're supposed to be nice to each other, and peace and love, yes, 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 but why does that make him any more special than Gandhi or Martin Luther King or somebody like that? Wasn't he just a great teacher? And to my mind, and this is an historical argument, to my mind, when you look at what happens to the church after the crucifixion, it's clear that something's going on here. Because remember, I just said, a Messiah, somebody who claims to be a Messiah, shows up in Jerusalem and leads a rebellion against the Romans. That happens over and over and over again. And the Romans slaughter them all, and their followers just drift away. So think of this from the point of view of the apostles, who followed Jesus, followed his ministry. The Romans arrest him, he gets crucified, he's dead. You'd expect, because this is what happens every other time, they would just drift away. But instead, something very different happens. These are, and it was really nicely laid out on my original computer. The fonts have messed me up here. So imagine that this is perfectly lined up, and you'll be very impressed. So we've got 13 names here. These are the 12 apostles. Take away Judas, put in Judas's replacement Matthias, and then add the apostle Paul, who's kind of like an apostle after the fact. So 13. And look at what happens to them. Martyred, 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 martyred. Look at where they go. All over the ancient world, all over Rome, and outside of Rome. Armenia, India, Ethiopia, those aren't places in Rome. So you'd expect that after they watched their leader get crucified, they would have just kind of drifted back to being fishermen. But they don't. They go all over the world, and they die for their faith. That's very strange. And so I think that's the best argument for why this is not, we're not just talking about a teacher here. This is somebody that these people think is very, very different. So, and they start carrying the faith around. And so this, I like this map because it's K-State purple, of course. Yeah, K-State. Yeah. This is the expansion of Christianity after the crucifixion, after the resurrection. And so you can see here the difference the Roman Empire makes. With Roman Empire, it's safe to travel at sea. And so the Christianity spreads around the shores of the Mediterranean, moves inland, and begins to spread all around the Roman world, and then again outside the Roman world. But easiest within Rome because of all the advantages that staying within the Roman Empire offers, but also outside of Rome. Okay. So I want to talk about where these converts are coming from. Like, who are these people who are becoming Christian? What's going on? Now, if you go back to the book of Acts. If you have a chance, reread the book of Acts and think about what it is the apostles do. When Paul, the apostle, is sort of traveling around, first thing he does is go to a synagogue. And you think, why does he go to a synagogue? Well, Paul's a Jew, and so the sort of synagogue is a place where you're going to find other Jews. But remember how I'd said that ancient religion really leaves people a little bit cold. Ancient religion, ancient polytheism doesn't give you a guidance on how to live your life, doesn't explain the universe in a way that makes sense to these thousands of gods who are all powerful. So what you see in the ancient world is there's lots of people who admire the Jews, who find Roman religion that just doesn't make sense, but they admire the Jews because one God makes a lot more sense intellectually. It makes sense a lot more than thousands of gods. The Jews are admired for their personal morality, the way they themselves behave and the way they treat people. They're admired for the charity. Now, the Jews take care of their own, widows and orphans. It's not necessarily common in the ancient world, but the Jews take care of their own. They're admired for that. And so what you get are people who congregate around synagogues who like the moral teachings of the Jews and want to be associated with that, but are not necessarily fully Jewish. And there are reasons why they're not fully Jewish. They're called God-fearers. The term for these people is God-fearers because they're associating with the Jews, they like the Jewish religion, but they're not fully becoming Jews. And there's three reasons for that, three problems. One is the Jews are an ethnically distinct people. And it is possible to convert to Judaism, but it's not easy because the Jews are a particular people. It's not a universal faith. So you can get in and become a Jew, but it's not simple. That's one. Two, bacon is tasty. And I'm a little flippant there, but the Jewish dietary restrictions, all the rules about what you can eat and what you can't eat are very complicated and difficult for people to accept who haven't grown up in it. And the last, we'll just say it's the you want me to cut off what problem? So there's obstacles to becoming a Jew, things that make people reluctant to become Jews. What early Christians find is the people who had been attracted to Judaism are natural converts to Christianity because Christianity offers the moral teachings, it offers the universe that makes sense, it offers a community that takes care of its own, and it's universal. Christianity wants everybody to be part of it. It's not associated with a particular people. And so from person to person to person, the faith is spreading around the ancient world. And here, I'm going to bring in an idea of apostolic succession. It'll come back in a little bit later on. The idea of apostolic succession is, well, how do you know that you're getting real Christianity? Somebody shows up and they say they're bearing the faith. How do you know if it's authentic or not? The way that people traced that was essentially tracing a chain. Sort of, the leader of my Christian community got his faith from another leader of a Christian community who got his faith from Paul. Or my leader got his faith from Peter, who was a follower of Jesus directly. And so there's this sense of a chain from Jesus to the apostles to the leaders of Christian communities, this apostolic succession that carries through person to person and builds a church throughout the Roman Empire and the ancient world. The one exception to this really is Paul. There's the 12 apostles minus Judas. Paul never saw Jesus in his life. Paul converted after the fact, but Paul's kind of the exception that proves the rule. Paul actually went to the other apostles to get approved, in a sense, as an honorary apostle, to get a stamp of approval that his role was genuine, that God had spoken to him, and Paul then became and was treated as if he were one of the apostles, even though he had not been associated with Jesus during Jesus' lifetime on earth. Okay, so the church begins to grow. And it grows because it has this appeal. It has clear moral teachings. It's a community that takes care of its own. People can look at that and find things to admire and want to be a part of. Okay, so I've got an apologetic point coming up, but let me pause. Are there questions on anything so far? Once, going twice. Sold. Okay. So the apologetic point, and this has to do with the growth of this early church and where people are getting their faith from. And this is a question, this is particularly a Protestant question towards Catholics. Because most Protestant churches, almost every Protestant church, has as part of its essential beliefs the idea of sola scriptura, Scripture alone. That the sole authority for questions of religion is the Bible itself. And so a question from Protestants to Catholics often is, well, why do you have this role for church tradition? Why shouldn't everything we do and everything we believe be based strictly on the Bible? And I think there's a good historical answer to this question. A way to think about this, from my point of view, is to think about the way the Bible was written, the way the Bible was put together. And it's pretty clear when you compare the various Gospels to one another, when you compare them to the epistles, the letters that Paul writes, they're at the back of the New Testament, it's pretty easy to reconstruct what's going on, how these are put together, and the order in which they are written. And so there's a sense, and we're fairly clear that at some point in the 30s and 40s, so very quickly after the crucifixion, Jesus' followers put together his sayings. We don't have that as an independent collection, but it's very clear that Matthew and Luke use that collection of sayings. Matthew and Luke have essentially the same sayings of Jesus. The sayings of Jesus in Matthew are identical to the sayings in Luke, and so we think there's a common collection of sayings they're both using. Paul's letters are actually the first parts of the New Testament to be written down. So those are the epistles at the back. At the late 60s, Mark writes the first gospel. Matthew and Luke follow up using Mark. There are things they think Mark has not told the whole story. Matthew and Luke expand on Mark, bring in these sayings, and write their own version. The book of Acts, which I keep saying you should go back and read, Luke wrote Acts as well. So Luke and Acts really go together. They're sort of part 1 and part 2. And then Gospel of John comes last, probably in sometime in the 90s. So this is the order in which the New Testament books are written, the way they're put together. Now, here's the point to all this. The Gospels are written when the church is already expanding, and expanding rapidly. The church already exists. The church is moving and getting new followers. And so it's not as though the church comes into existence to follow the books of the New Testament. The church writes down the New Testament as a tool to help it do what it is already doing. The church starts to write down the books of the New Testament when people who lived during Jesus' lifetime are starting to die. They want to make sure this isn't lost, so they start writing down the books of the New Testament. But the church is already there. The New Testament comes into existence to serve the church, not the other way around. And again, to be kind of sarcastic about it, you think to yourself, well, gee, all these guys did is escape persecution and spread the faith all throughout the ancient world. Boy, think what they could have accomplished if they had a Bible in their hands. They didn't. They had a message, and they had the way they lived their lives, and then they wrote down the New Testament to help them do that. So that's why I think there's a good historical case for not just relying on the Bible itself, but paying attention to the traditions of the church that existed before there was a New Testament. Okay. Let's see where we are now. How are we doing on time? Okay, good. So these new Christians have to figure out who they are, like where they fit into the world. They've got a message, but who are they and what do they do? One of the things I find interesting in looking back at the early church is the way in which it thinks of itself and it pictures itself is different than the way we do now. This is early Christian art portraying Jesus. And it's worth thinking, sort of, how do we picture Jesus? And you think, well, of course, everybody knows Jesus has long hair and a beard. You know, if it doesn't have long hair and a beard, it can't be Jesus. This is Jesus as the Good Shepherd, and notice he's clean-shaven with short hair. Their picture of what he looked like was different than ours. But this was a very popular image of Jesus in the early church, as the Good Shepherd caring for his flock. But these early Christians had to figure out who they were, what it was they believed, where they belonged in the world. And the church begins to follow a path kind of midway between two extremes. There's one extreme, and I give you the term on the chart, the Ebionites, who essentially see Jesus as a Jew, and the early Christians as just another kind of Jew. There's multiple flavors of Jews, different kind of sects within Judaism. And the Ebionites see themselves as Christians as just another part of Judaism. So that's one, is to see Christianity as really not anything new, but just another part of Judaism. That's one kind of extreme. The other extreme is to see Christianity as having nothing to do with Judaism. And so there's a couple groups, the Marcionites and then the Gnostics, who come later, see themselves as having nothing to do with Judaism and the Old Testament. From their point of view, the Old Testament is all smitings. Lots of smitings and begets, and they don't like the Old Testament at all. And so they pretend, from the Gnostic point of view, the Old Testament is about a different God. There's a different mad and angry God of the Old Testament. The Jesus of the New Testament is entirely different. And one of the things to note about these kind of two extremes is that they read the Bible selectively. The Ebionites essentially take their lesson from Mark and some degree Matthew. Those are the books that are most Jewish in the New Testament. The Marcionites and the Gnostics take all their stuff from Luke, since that's the least Jewish. They're kind of picking and choosing from the Gospels in order to come up with their tradition. The emerging church itself is kind of going between those two extremes and seeing Christianity as a fulfillment and a continuation of the Jewish faith, not as either nothing but the Jewish faith or as entirely alien to the Jewish faith, but as coming out of it. Okay. So far, so good. Questions, I think? All right. I think I've got an apologetic point coming up next. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So another question that people have about the Catholic Church. Organization and hierarchy. Oftentimes, kind of the Protestant tradition emphasizes the early church, going back to the traditions of the early church, and rejects organization and hierarchy. Reasonable question, but I think there's a good historical answer to this. And there's a couple different ways to think about this. One is that if you read the book of Acts, and I apologize for sounding like a broken record, but go back and take a look at the book of Acts. In the book of Acts, which is covering what's going on in the church in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, so very soon after the crucifixion, the church is already putting in place organization. When all you've got are 12 apostles, you don't need a lot of organization. As the Christian community is getting bigger all the time, it needs organization. And among the first pieces of this we see are the creation of deacons, the office of deacon in the book of Acts. The apostles find that they are so overwhelmed with the spiritual needs of this new Christian community that they can't deal with the administrative job of handling charity, kind of caring for the poor, caring for widows, caring for orphans. And so the apostles create deacons as people whose job it is to carry out some of this kind of concrete social work that the apostles don't have the time to do. They're splitting up jobs. They're creating organization. So already in the book of Acts, the church is creating organization to deal with concrete problems. The other thing to talk about in terms of the early church is how early is early. And there's a nice little piece of evidence I found that I think is terrific for illustrating what it means to go back to the early church. So this is a comparison of the Christian church in the city of Rome in the year 250 AD and the Salina Diocese as of 2013. And I couldn't believe the numbers worked as well as they did when I found these. So I promise I'm not making these up. These are exactly the numbers I found. In the Church of Rome, one thing to in the church in the city of Rome in 250 AD is illegal. So this is an underground organization. It's enormous, but it's an illegal organization. So what is it made up of? It has a bishop who's the leader of that Christian community in Rome. There are 46 presbyters, and presbyters are priests. The word priest comes from presbyter. And there are 7 deacons, and the deacons, again, are the people who take care of charity work. Well, what about the Salina Diocese? And this is approximately the same number of faithful. The same number of faithful you have in Rome in 250 AD and the number in the Salina Diocese in 2013 would be ballpark the same. You have 1 bishop, 47 priests, 22 retired, 7 deacons. So in a sense, there's not necessarily a lot of difference in this sort of organization. The church at the local level looks an awful lot then like it does now. And to kind of bring this point home, I want to talk a little about these offices. Who are these people? What are they doing? What are the jobs of these individuals? So that's where we're headed next. One thing I think that oftentimes makes history seem complicated is that it's just that the terms seem weird and alien and tough to understand. But these terms for offices in the early Christian church are just Greek. And if you spoke Greek, they'd make perfect sense. Bishop comes from episkop, which means overseer, someone who oversees. Epi, like epidermis, scop, like telescope, so a bishop is an overseer. A presbyter is an elder. A deacon is a servant. An apostle is just a messenger. These are very simple terms when you look at the Greek. So how does this work? What's the organization of the church? And we kind of see in this the organization of the church we have now, where it comes from. Okay, so the base level of the church is an individual church community. And for the first Christians, that's going to be a very small number. The church is small, it's illegal, it would tend to meet in people's houses. And so in the very earliest stages, the term bishop, episcop, and presbyter, elder or priest, were pretty much interchangeable. They'd use the same word for the same guy. at the head of the local community. But the church grows. And as soon as the church is too big to be kind of contained in a single house, you get two roles developing out of this. And so the way that would work is you would have individual priests or presbyters, same thing, multiple ones underneath a bishop who's the overall leader of that community. And typically bishops would live in cities. Roman Empire has lots of cities. A bishop would live in a city, and so there'd be multiple presbyters or priests in a city, also kind of outlying towns. There might be some presbyters out there as well. Now, what begins to happen then is certain cities are bigger and more important than others. They have larger communities. And so what begins to happen is that the bishops in bigger cities, so there might be a bishop, let's say Salina in Kansas City, for the sake of argument. Not that we don't love Salina, but let's say Salina in Kansas City. You'd have a bishop of Salina and a bishop of Kansas City. But Kansas City's bigger. And so the bishop of Kansas City would, in effect, he would live in a metropolis, and so he would become, once I get a dry erase marker that actually works, he would become a metropolitan bishop. This is the origin of archbishops. So a bishop of an important city would then have a kind of supervisory oversight role of bishops in places around. And because he lives in a metropolis, he's called a metropolitan bishop. And again, archbishop essentially is an evolution of that. Now, the next stage in terms of organization is that some cities are really, really, really big and important. And the most important, the biggest cities in the Roman Empire, had metropolitan bishops who had extremely important roles, and they became patriarchs. And there's 5 of them, and these guys are going to come back into the story. I'm going to give them to you now, but I'm going to talk more about them later. And the 5 are Rome, the capital, Constantinople, and I'm going to talk about that in just a little bit, Constantinople, Antioch, which is in what's now Syria, Alexandria, which is in Egypt, and then Jerusalem. So there's 5 patriarchs in the Roman world. But they're still basically bishops. The kind of the fundamental organizational role is the bishop. And so these are bishops who just are in important places and so have a kind of administrative role that other bishops don't have. Now the point of all this, and I don't have it on a slide, but the point of all this is that the organization we see is an evolution in response to new situations and new needs. The organization grows up because the church is bigger. The church that can fit in a single room when Jesus is crucified can no longer do that. And as it gets bigger, it incorporates more people with different roles because it itself is more complex. And so I think oftentimes it's too easy to say, we should just go back to the early church, without bearing in mind that the church evolves the organization it does to deal with concrete, specific problems that it has to deal with. Okay, so far so good. Yes, question? That varies a lot from place to place. When I was in grad school in history, I was always told, never worry about being asked questions, because if you're asked a question you don't know the answer, you can always say, it varied a lot from place to place. This is a case where it really did vary a lot from place to place. In some cases, it's local priests who elect bishops. In some cases, it's actually the local population. The faithful of a community will pick a bishop. St. Augustine, who's sort of famous early theologian in the church, St. Augustine was essentially drafted to be a bishop. Everybody loved him and thought he was a very holy man, and so when the old bishop died, essentially a mob grabs him and says, you must be the bishop, we've got to have you. In other cases, the metropolitan bishops can have an appointive role. I mean, it really does vary a lot over time and over place. I mean, what the church has now is that the Pope appoints bishops, but at this point, there isn't that level of regulation of the system. There's a lot of different ways and paths to become a bishop at this particular period of time. No, I mean, so hold that thought, because I'm going to be talking about that just a little bit down the road, because what you have is, there's a bishop of Rome, and I said that the basic kind of organizational structure of the church is built around bishops, and so the Pope's basic office is, he's the Bishop of Rome. Now, being Bishop of Rome means the Pope has a lot of other jobs too, but he's the Bishop of Rome. And so we have a Bishop of Rome who's the sort of the ancestor of the Pope, and the way that role is going to kind of develop, I'm going to talk about after the break.
Were they already becoming political at this point?
Well, this is, remember, at this point, right now, the church is still illegal. So these bishops and patriarchs are technically breaking the law. And depending on time and place, they could be more or less above ground or they're going underground. So they can't do a lot of politics yet because it's illegal. I'm going to talk again after the break. We're going to talk about when they have a political role, and especially in another week. And the short answer, which I'll talk a lot more about next week, is when there's a functioning government, then the bishops don't have to be especially political. If that functioning government goes away, if there's no more Roman Empire to police the streets and keep order, then the bishops are forced into political roles. But that's something we'll talk a lot more about next week. Yes?
So all these titles come from Greek. Did Pope also come from Greek, or is that an
No, Pope essentially is like Papa. I mean, it means it's father. So that, I mean, lots of languages use Papa for father. So essentially it's that. It's not as specifically Greek as all the rest of these. There's all sorts of Greek you're going to get tonight. It's going to be fantastic. Okay, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll take 5 minutes, grab some candy, stretch your legs, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about persecution. So, yes?
On your purpley map.
So, I promised we would pick back up with persecution. I've mentioned a couple times that Christianity was illegal in the Roman Empire. And just let me give you an example. I mentioned early Christian art and early representations of Christianity. One of the earliest pieces of artistic evidence for Christianity is actually anti-Christian. This is called the Alexamenos graffiti, and it's from Rome about the year 150. And so what you've got here is a carving on a wall, and then this is a reproduction of it in black and white just to make it easier to see. And what you've got here is a caption that says Alexamenos, that's this guy's name, Alexamenos worships his God, and you've got a crucified jackass. So what does this tell us? It tells us Alexamenos is a Christian. His friend doesn't think very highly of that or of Christianity. So it gives us a sense that there were people who were Christian, who had people around them who didn't like it, who thought of it as in some way evil, bad, not right. So what's exactly going on here? How are we going to make sense of the place of Christianity? Why is it illegal? Why is it persecuted? What is it that the Romans are getting upset about in terms of the existence of Christianity? Essentially, what upsets the Romans about Christianity is they're endangering things for everybody else by failing to worship the traditional gods. They refuse to worship the Roman emperor. In Rome, by the time of the empire, it's common for emperors to be made gods, to be treated as gods. Now, educated people knew that these are ordinary men, that they're not really gods, but Roman educated people didn't think it was any big deal to pour out a little wine in front of a statue of the emperor or sacrifice a dove. They didn't think it was any big deal. Jews and Christians thought it was a very big deal. You know, worship belongs to God, not to a human being. But from the Roman point of view, when the Christians are failing to worship the emperor, when they're failing to worship the traditional God, they're putting other people at risk because Jupiter might get mad and throw thunderbolts. Poseidon might sink a ship. There's all sorts of bad things that can happen if you don't worship the traditional gods, and Christians refuse to do that. Now, the Jews also refuse to do this, but the Romans cut the Jews some slack. And essentially the reason for that is the Romans liked old things. If it's old and traditional, the Romans thought it was great. And so from the Roman point of view, Judaism was old. And because it was old, the Jews had kind of a get-out-of-jail-free card. They didn't have to worship the emperor. From the Roman point of view, the Christians are new. They've come out of nowhere, and they're saying they don't want to worship the emperor, and for the Romans, that's not okay. They do not get the pass that the Jews get because they're old and traditional. Now, what does this mean concretely? The status of Christianity varies enormously from place to place. In some places and sometimes Christians come in for very severe persecution. In other places and other times, local authorities kind of don't particularly worry about it very much and turn a blind eye. And I've found, and please don't report me to anybody for this, work with me on this analogy. I think the way to think about the status of Christians in the Roman Empire is like pot smokers. So again, work with me here. First of all, let's say you live in a dorm, And so you know some people in the dorm who are into marijuana. What do? They go behind closed doors on weekends, lock the door, and they're up to something. You don't really know what. See, maybe you're not quite sure, but they're up to something in your little group by themselves. When they come out, they talk to you about peace and love. They keep saying, why don't you join us? It'll be fun. You'll really like it. It'll change your life, man. And so they'd like you to come to join them in these little locked rooms. In some places, it would be fine. If you were in Oklahoma City in the middle of the street smoking pot, the police would probably arrest you. If you go to Boulder and the cops ask if you have drugs and you say no, they'll give you some. So again, it just really varies. You just don't know. And so some places and sometimes Christianity comes in for lots of attack. Other places, it really doesn't. And so in some senses, this for Christianity is the best of both worlds. Certainly there are individual Christians who die. I mean, I don't mean to minimize that. There are people who are martyrs for the faith who are, in effect, presented with a choice. And the way this works, and we have a great exchange of letters between a local governor and the emperor about what to do about these Christians. And the local governor says, we've got these Christians, they don't sacrifice to the gods, there's all these stories about what they get up to, they call everybody brother and sister, so we think they're committing incest, they're talking about eating people, and it's just bad stuff. So he writes off to the emperor and says, what do I do? And the emperor says, okay, well, don't just take sort of hearsay, you need a real accusation, but if somebody's accused, there's somebody who's accusing somebody else of being a Christian, bring them in and ask them if they want to make a sacrifice. And if they're willing to make a sacrifice to the emperor, send them home. If they're not, give them another chance. If they still won't sacrifice, you got to execute them. So, if Christians are laying low, or if they've got a governor that's not willing to sort of track them down, then they're fine. But this is a crime. If somebody wants to go after the Christians, they really can. And so there's a series of particular persecutions. One of the first big ones, there's individual persecutions earlier, but one of the first big ones is under the Emperor Nero in 64 AD. Nero was completely nuts. But he was an emperor, and so when you're the emperor and you're completely nuts, you can pretty much do what you want. And so the population of Rome is not happy that the emperor is crazy, and so Nero needs a scapegoat, and he uses Christians as a useful scapegoat, and starts cracking down on the Christian population of Rome. But it's just Rome. He's focusing on one particular area. So in the rest of the empire, Christianity can keep growing. Same thing true under Domitian. There's a temporary persecution that doesn't last that long. These emperors keep getting assassinated, and so they don't sustain these things for very long, and it tends to be fairly local. But oftentimes, these sorts of persecutions actually bring attention to the faith. Because Romans who were sitting in an arena watching gladiator fights, sort of, as intermission between the gladiator fights, they bring out some Christians and feed them to starving animals. And so people sitting there would ask, what's in this particular faith that would make people die instead of pouring out a little wine in front of a statue of the emperor? So there are lots of ways in which these persecutions can bring new people to the faith. The most dangerous persecution, the one that's sustained the longest, that is systematic across the entire empire and does the most damage, is under the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian is a convinced pagan, polytheist to his core, sacrificing to the old gods, and he was trying to do a sacrifice to predict the future, and he thought that what his sacrifice was being spoiled by Christian prayers in the neighborhood. And so he decides, that's it, crack down everywhere. And this one is bad. This one really takes a toll on the church, but it doesn't last forever. And the circumstances under which it changes are pretty dramatic. And that has to do with the Emperor Constantine. So Diocletian, I just mentioned, is the one who initiates this empire-wide campaign of persecution against Christians. Diocletian wants to retire. Most Roman emperors are assassinated. Diocletian would like to die in his bed. And manages to do it. And what he does is he sets up a system where there are multiple sub-emperors around the empire who will run little local areas. But as soon as Diocletian does that, these little local emperors immediately go to war with one another to become the single emperor. So think Game of Thrones. That's exactly the analogy. Sort of all these guys are going after each other to become king, emperor of the Roman Empire. Constantine is one of them. His mother was Christian, Helena. And she comes into the story later, and I'll try to remember to bring up Helena again. So his mother's Christian. He's familiar with Christianity. But he's not Christian himself when he begins his campaign to become emperor. He's a pagan. But in the course of the campaigns to conquer the Roman Empire and defeat the other rivals for power, he's outside of Rome on the eve of a battle and has a vision. Now, what precisely this vision is a little hard to say. There's a couple different accounts of what he says about what his vision is, but it's clear that he believes something has happened to him, that he has gotten a message. And that message is, in this sign you will conquer. And the sign's not the cross, it's the Chi-Rho. So in Greek, the first two letters of Christ are Chi, the X, and then Rho, this P. So that symbol, the Chi-Rho, is the symbol that Constantine puts on his banners and on the shields of his soldiers because he believes he's gotten a message from God to win the battle. He will fight under the sign of Jesus, and he wins. And so Constantine from that point is convinced that this was a true message from God, that it's his duty to make the Roman Empire safe for Christians. So the year after this battle's in 312, the very next year, he issues an edict, the Edict of Milan in 313, which overnight, with the stroke of a pen, makes Christianity a legal faith in the Roman Empire. So it goes from running scared under Diocletian, with lots and lots of Christians thrown in prison and martyred, to it's legal now. And in essence, all the bishops and priests and faithful who've been worshiping underground, literally underground, are kind of pulled out into the open air, and now they can practice their faith openly and do missionary work openly and proselytize openly, look for new converts. So there's all sorts of things that are going to happen to the church as a result now of becoming legal as a result of Emperor Constantine. Now, Constantine himself does not formally become a Christian for many years. He's not baptized until he's on his deathbed. But there are very clear reasons for doing that. From Constantine's point of view, he's the emperor, and he's going to need to kill people. I mean, it's just, if you're the emperor, that's going to be part of the job. There are people who are going to need to die. And so he would prefer not to suffer eternity in hell, and so he wants to wait to be baptized until right before his death, because the thought is baptism wipes away every sin. And so lots of people in positions of political authority would do this. They would hold off on baptism until they're right before they're ready to die, get baptized, totally clean of sin, and then you're good to go. Now, a statue falls on him before he's baptized, and he's in big trouble. But he's fairly confident that he will make it through and is baptized on his deathbed. There's a lot of historians who've argued, well, he wasn't really a Christian, but it's very clear. He's doing all these things for the Christian faith. He's taking an active role in promoting Christianity. It's just that he wants to hold off on baptism because of his job. All right. So there's several things that are going on now in terms of the church that are changing things around. They're changing a lot of stuff. One is that he sets up the model for the relationship between the church and government that's going to last for the next 1,700 years in the Western world. And that is that Constantine does not make himself the head of the church. He could have. I mean, he's the Roman emperor. He can do anything. He has absolute authority. And so if he decided to make himself the head of the Christian church, there wouldn't have been a lot to stop him. But he does not see that as his role. He sees his role as protecting the church and supporting it, but not running it. And that tradition is going to continue. The idea that the head of state power does not actually control the church is going to last far longer than Constantine. He builds a new capital city. I mentioned Constantinople. Constantine moves the capital from Rome to Constantinople. It's just a coincidence that Constantinople sounds a lot like Constantine. No, that was a lie. Actually, he names it after himself. He may be sort of a big friend of the Christian faith, but he's not exactly modest. So he moves the capital to Constantinople, which is what now Istanbul, and gives the church lots and lots of stuff, and in particular, buildings. And so our picture today of what a kind of traditional Catholic church looks like comes from Constantine. Because he's the emperor of Rome, he's got lots and lots of buildings at his disposal, and he gives them all to the church. And in particular, he gives the church basilicas. This is still a building that's standing. It dates back to Constantine's time. It's been repaired and expanded since that point. Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, he grants to the Church of Rome. This is still part of the kind of the Pope's holdings as the Pope in Rome. A basilica is a particular kind of Roman building. So a basilica comes from the word for king. In Greek, a king is basileus, and basil, the root of king, basilica is a king's building. It's where a king would hold court, both in terms of meeting with people and of actually ruling in court cases. And so if you think of not so much like St. Isidore's or Thomas More, but an older Catholic church, kind of imagine what it looks like. You've got kind of pillars down both sides. You come in here, pillars down both sides. The actional takes place up here. You've got these rounded areas in the back. That's a basilica because it was originally built to have the king or a judge or some important official sitting here, and people would come in and conduct their business, and at the same time other people can be making, sort of setting up real estate deals or whatever around here. Constantine hands over hundreds of these buildings to the church, which converts them into places of worship. And so an old Catholic church, and lots of other denominations too, you'll see the same kind of basic design of this bowed-out area at the back with the altar, pews down here, but then these rows of columns down the side. Okay, so the buildings are nice and all, but one thing to point out about buildings, remember, Christianity had been illegal. Ancient polytheism, sort of paganism, polytheism, where you sacrifice, that had actually been done in the open air. If you think about pagan temples like the Parthenon in Greece, you wouldn't actually have a religious ceremony inside. Inside is basically storage rooms. You have pagan religious ceremonies out in front in the do the sacrifices sort of under the sky. Christianity is illegal. You can't worship outside. So Christians have this tradition of worshiping indoors, and so they need buildings, and they get a lot of buildings from Constantine, and then build new churches along the same kind of design up into the present day. Now, Constantine has a lot of things that he wants to see the church do. He's not going to dictate to the church exactly what it's supposed to do, but he wants the church to be put in order. And in particular, the church during the persecutions, and as it's been underground, has gotten disorganized. And in particular, a lot of heresies have kind of sprung up. Disputes about belief and what it is that Christians really stand for. And Constantine, he's a soldier. He wants order. He wants to see the church put into order. And so what he sets up is a council. This is the Council of Nicaea. Luckily, we had a photographer there who was able to capture the moment for us, so we have a good sense of what was going on. He sets up the Council of Nicaea, which is just outside of Constantinople, to set up for the church a clear and concise statement of what it is the church believes. What does it mean to be a Christian? And so, I was joking about the photograph thing, in case you were wondering. But you can see, this is Constantine. He's the one with the crown. All the rest of these guys are bishops. The idea of these church councils is you summon the bishops from all over the world to come to one place to together work out exactly what it is on a question of belief. If there's some problem, a dispute about what it is that Christians should believe, the bishops get together and together figure out what authority means and what it is that people should, what the proper place is for people to think where the view of the church as a group is going to come together. Okay. Now, even though Constantine sets this up and attends, he's not presiding over this. He's not running the thing. He is there because he wants to see the church put into order. He's not there to dictate what the solutions are going to be. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about Nicaea, what it does, the Nicene Creed, and how all this fits together. Before I do that, are there questions on anything so far? Yes? Gotcha. A little bit. I mean, the split between the Catholic and the Eastern Church is going to be next week. So we're headed in that direction. I mean, Catholic essentially means universal. And so there's always a sense in which we can call ourselves Catholic, and because Christianity claims to be a universal church. It's a church for everybody. But Catholic as opposed to Orthodox, the Eastern churches, that's going to come next week. We're going to get some early hints of it here, but that's going to be for next week. Other questions? Okay, so what's Nicaea doing? There's a few things to talk about here. So we're going to be bringing in kind of organization of the church, beliefs, the creed, and a lot of things to talk about. Okay, first of all, one of the contexts for what's going on at Nicaea is, as I said, There we go. Okay, good. When in doubt, shake it around a little bit. Okay. Okay, so in the history of the church, there are disputes about sort of what it is that Christians need to believe. How are Christians to understand what they're supposed to believe? And that plays into, and this gets back a little bit to the question we had before, the relationships among these patriarchs, the leading figures of the church. And there's always been a sense of, to some degree, rivalry among the patriarchs about whenever there's a dispute over what to believe, about they don't always agree, they don't always see eye to eye, and they need to work this out. Now, Rome has always claimed to be first among equals among the patriarchs. Now, they're all patriarchs, so in that sense they're the same rank, but Rome has claimed a place not of superiority in the sense of being able to dictate to the others, but of having some degree of precedence in terms of honor, in terms of its place among the 5 patriarchs, but again, without the right to dictate. And there's 3 reasons for Rome to claim this place. One is that Peter and Paul, the apostles, the 2 most important apostles, Peter and Paul, both were martyred in Rome. Peter goes to Rome, becomes the first bishop of Rome, and dies there, is martyred. Paul, the apostle who carries Christianity to the non-Jews of the Roman Empire, Paul goes to Rome and is martyred there. So that gives Rome a certain standing. Peter and Paul both die there. In the Gospels, Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, you are the rock on which I will build my church." So Peter is given a charge from Jesus to be the rock on which the church is going to be built. Rome was the capital. I mean, Constantine moves the capital, but before that point, Rome's the capital of the empire. That makes Rome important. The other thing that gives Rome a certain place is that in the disputes over how Christianity is going to grow, what Christians really believe, Rome always ends up on the side that turns out to be right, in the sense that other patriarchs in other places sometimes kind of go off the rails. And we'll talk about the way in which you can go off the rails in a little bit, some of these heresies that the Council of Nicaea is set up to deal with. But some of these other patriarchs kind of go off the rails down some weird path and then get brought back. And that never happens to Rome. And people notice this at the time. And so over the years, Rome has this sense of itself as the patriarch that will defend the true faith. Now, the other patriarchs don't necessarily see it in quite this way. They see themselves as all being kind of equal. But Rome is able to claim this particular place. And we'll see how that works out next week in terms of the split between the Catholic Church and the Eastern churches. So Nicaea is set up to try to clarify what it is that Christians believe. And there's lots of ways that this can get kind of complicated. So I'm going to talk about some heresies. I find heresies very interesting. They get really complicated, but they can be very interesting. So I want to just talk a bit about some of them and what it is that Nicaea is trying to do. Let me give you just a quick story to kind of understand a bit about Nicaea and the Nicene Creed that we recite every weekend. I have a cousin-in-law who's a lawyer, and he says that essentially every time you're looking at a legal contract and there's some weird, bizarre phrase in there, it's because somebody somewhere sometime tried to weasel out of a deal by making some crazy argument, and so after that happens, you got to put in a piece in the contract that makes it impossible to weasel out of the deal in that way. And the Nicene Creed, in a way, is setting up language to prevent people from going completely off the rails in terms of belief. And I'll illustrate this with some examples that come out of Nicaea. Okay, so there's all sorts of ways that people can kind of go off track in terms of belief. One of them, and this is the easiest one to kind of understand, is heresies of authority. Like, for example, if I were to say that the Holy Spirit just spoke to me and you should give me your money because that's what the Holy Spirit says, you might be skeptical. Not everybody who says God spoke to me actually was spoken to by God. But there are examples in the history of the church of particular people who claim special authority that's been given to them and lead people kind of down weird paths. But those tend to not outlive the person who comes up with them. Generally speaking, if a person says, God spoke to me and you need to do this weird thing that I think is great, that doesn't tend to last longer than the person. There are other ones, though, and they tend to fall into a couple of categories. And like I say, I'm really into kind of heresies. I think they're fascinating, so I'm going to talk a little bit about them, and you're all my victims. So there's 2 different kinds of problems that people tend to run into. One is the Trinity. And these are the reason people run into problems is because these are very complicated issues. For example, the Trinity, the idea that there's one God, but that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So how does that work? How are the three, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, linked together in one? What's the precise way that that's going to work? That's a kind of tough question to get at. That's why we call it a mystery. But it turns out there's lots of ways that this can go really wrong. The other problem is not just issues of the Trinity and sort of the three persons, but the specific issue of Jesus. Because Christians are generally clear that Jesus is both God and man, that he's human and divine. But how exactly does that work? How is he both human and divine? And that gets kind of complicated. Now, there's ways in which you can answer those questions. How is Jesus both God and man? In ways that are quite dangerous. And I think the best example of this is the heresy called Docetism. And the Docetism comes from the Greek word to appear or to seem. And for the Docetists, it just doesn't make sense to think of God suffering. How can God suffer? And so the Docetists claimed that Jesus did not actually suffer on the cross. He just pretended to suffer on the cross. He appeared to suffer. And so, in effect, this is like Jesus is sort of a hologram or sort of God's and saying, oh no, please don't hang me on the cross. Ouch, no, that's very painful. Please stop. And so he pretended to suffer. And it doesn't take much to kind of think that really kind of tears the heart out of the whole point of Christianity. That God cares about us so much, he'll die for us. That God would suffer on a cross for us. And so the Docetists kind of just gut that. And so, in the Nicene Creed, this Council of Nicaea puts in specific language that Jesus suffered death and was buried. And we say that every Sunday. Suffered death and was buried. And it's in there specifically to say, Docetists got this one wrong. Jesus did not appear to suffer, he suffered. Now, there's one aspect to this in terms of the issues of the incarnation. Docetism is one. The other one I want to talk about is the Miaphysites. Mia means mixed, and phys means nature. So Miaphysites are mixed nature. Now, the Catholic teaching on Jesus is that Jesus is both fully human and fully divine, God and man, both. The Miaphysite position is that that Jesus is human and divine natures entirely mixed together. Now, if you have a PhD in philosophy and are fluent in ancient Greek, you could probably make me a good argument one way or the other. But for most of us, this gets a little outside of our sphere of experience and expertise. And so lots of theologians have argued that the Miaphysites and the Catholic position are actually reconcilable, that we're really talking about the same thing in slightly different language. And this has real effects on the real world, because Miaphysites, that's the current position of three important churches: the Coptic Church, Egyptian Christians, the Ethiopian Church, and the Armenian Church. So essentially, the one big obstacle to unity between the Catholic Church and these churches is whether their position that Jesus is fully human and fully divine mixed up, and the Catholic position that Jesus is fully human and fully divine not mixed up. That doesn't seem so hard to overcome. And Pope John Paul II actually was making a very high priority to achieve a kind of mutual understanding on these questions, and it's actually made good progress. So this is a case where kind of the study of theology and working out issues of theology can make real differences in real people's lives and bring us closer to one universal church of all Christians together. Now, one other example of heresies that I want to talk about is Arianism. And Arianism is one of the bigger ones. That's one that has a lot of adherents, lots of problems on through the Middle Ages. And Arianism isn't specifically about Jesus and the divine and human sides of Jesus. It has to do with the relationship between the Father and the Son and the Holy Trinity. But again, I'm going to bring this back to the Nicene Creed and the creed that we use on Sundays. Arianism takes the position that in the Trinity, the Father is greater than the Son. So as opposed to three equal parts of the Trinity, the Father is greater than the Son. And specifically, the Father created the Son. The Arians even had this little kind of nursery rhyme, that there was a time when the Father was there and the Son wasn't. That God the Father existed for a time, created the Son, made the Son, So the Son is God, but just kind of sort of lesser God, not quite so God. And this, again, was something that's being argued about at Nicaea. Because, again, it seems to take away from the heart of the faith. That it wasn't some kind of lesser God that died for us. It was God came down to earth and died for us. For the Arians, it's sort of, God 2.0, the kind of the lesser God, the sort of pale imitation of God. And so the Nicene Creed is set up in very specific ways to make it clear that Catholic belief is that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are equal, that Jesus Christ the Son is not less than the Father, and in particular, that the Father didn't make the Son. Because if you make something, you make it out of something else. So, I'm going to bring all this back to the Nicene Creed, I promise. I'm going to get there. So what do we say in the Nicene Creed? When we say the Creed on Sundays, we say, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten not made, consubstantial with the Father. The whole point of that language in the Nicene Creed is to say, the God the Father and God the Son are equal. One is not made from the other. They are the same substance. And I give you the two Greek terms, just to show how complicated this gets. The Arian position is that God the Son and God the Father are homoousia, similar substance. Because God the Father made God the Son, so he's not the same as God the Father is not the same as God the Son. The Catholic position becomes homoousia, that they're the same substance, that God and the Father and God the Son are the same, one is not lesser than the other. So the Nicene Creed is set up, and it's what we use now to lay out what it is that Christians believe. And it's very easy, because we say it every Sunday, to kind of just get mechanical about it, but it's worth thinking about what exactly are we saying? Why is it in there? Why are we making these declarations of faith? And in many cases like this, they go back 2,000 years, the reasons why we say what we say and we believe what we believe. Okay, I can go on for hours and hours about heresies, but I think we would probably be best to cut this one short now. Questions on anything so far? Yes? No, Arianism died out a long time ago, like sort of 500s and 600s. The last Arians sort of were gone. But you will get certain contemporary Christian churches, they're called anti-Trinitarian, that reject the Trinity. Most Christian churches accept God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. There are some Christian churches that are not Trinitarian. And so in that sense, they're a little bit like Arianism in that they don't see this particular relationship, but Arianism itself is long gone and has not been around for quite a while. Okay.
And the Coptics are in Egypt?
Coptics are in Egypt, yeah.
They're about persecution,
Right.
But otherwise doing okay.
Yeah, I mean, the Coptics are probably 10% of the Egyptian population is Christian. I mean, most of the population of Egypt is Muslim. But yes, depending on the particular political situation in Egypt, they can be more or less persecuted. But yes, they are not part of the Catholic Church, but the point that I wanted to make is, in terms of belief, the obstacle is this fairly subtle one between divine and human being mixed together in Jesus and divine and human as two natures in Jesus. And again, unless you've got a PhD in theology, explaining exactly what that means is going to be kind of hard. And again, Pope John Paul authority to try to rebuild Christian unity and bring churches back together. Okay, so just a couple more things in terms of the implications of Christianity being a legal faith, and we will be on our way. The transition for Christianity is remarkably fast. Because remember, under Diocletian at the beginning of the 300s, the church is undergoing its worst persecution in its history. In 313, the church becomes legal. By the end of the 300s, it's the only legal faith. At the time of, I don't need that quite yet. At the time that Constantine becomes a Christian, sort of makes Christianity legal, historians say Christianity is probably 10% of the population of the Roman Empire. It goes from 10% to 90% in the course of a single century. So the beginning of the 300s, the church is persecuted, but about 10% of the population. The end of the century, it's about 90% of the population. And the Emperor Theodosius, at the end of the 300s, sort of ends pagan worship. Sort of pagan temples are closed down, and Christianity becomes the only public faith that allowed inside the Roman Empire. But this has some kind of funny implications for Christians who And the analogy I use is you can sort of think, to some degree, it's kind of like the stereotypical hipster who says, you know, I really like this band until they got popular, but now that they're popular, all people are jumping on the bandwagon. It's not cool anymore. And so there's a certain degree in which Christians, you know, it's nice to not be illegal anymore, but it becomes easy to be Christian. Christianity is kind of hard when it's 10% of the population and it's illegal. When it's legal, then anybody can do it. And so there's a sense in which there are Christians who want a greater challenge. You know, martyrdom, sort of dying for your faith, is a pretty big challenge. Now martyrdom, it's legal. There are Christians who want challenges and who are looking for ways to kind of test themselves and test their faith. And they can do that in ways that to our eyes look, frankly, a little weird. And one example of this are the stylites. The stylites are people who display their faith by standing on top of pillars. And so this is Simeon the Stylite. And again, this is not the most detailed picture of Simeon the Stylite, but this is Simeon with a long beard on top of a pole. And so, you know, he's not 50 feet in the air, but he's like sort of 10, 15, 20 feet off the ground on a little platform about 2 feet by 2 feet. And he has a rail, and so when he's feeling tired or feels like giving himself a break, he can hold on to the rail, but otherwise he's just going to stand there day and night, year-round. And people will climb up to bring him food and water, and he will pray. And he'll do this for decades. Now, this tends to be something that happens in Egypt a lot. Egypt, for whatever reason, is a place where these sorts of events happen, these sort of people appear. And individual Christians will see guys like Simeon and want to be near them, to ask for their blessing, to ask for their advice, to ask for their prayers. And so Simeon gathers crowds around him. I mean, he can't do it because he's up on top of the pole, but people will gather around him to hear what he has to say, to ask for, to sort of kind of just be close to his presence. Something else that happens is that people decide that the way to show their faith and kind of test themselves and get closer to God is by retreating into the desert and becoming hermits. And in Egypt, that's easy to do, because in Egypt, you've got the Nile River and like 5 miles of fertile ground on both sides, and then it's desert. So if you're in Egypt and you want to get to the desert, it doesn't take very long. So what people will do is go off into the desert to be by themselves. And these are called eremitic monks. And eremitic is where we get our word hermit, because they're being by themselves, eremitic monks. But eremitic monks have a problem. Problem number one is that it's difficult for them to be by themselves, because I think there's Monty Python about this, Monty Python and Life of Brian. You know, he wants to be a holy man off in the desert by himself, but he's so holy, other people are going to follow him, and then he can't be by himself anymore. And so it's kind of self-defeating. You go off into the desert to live by yourself, and people follow you because you're so holy. That's problem one. Problem two is, it doesn't seem as though it's doing much for the kind of the community of Christians. This is a sort of all about me. I'm going to go off into the desert by myself, and it's about me. And so bishops in particular want to see something that's a little more disciplined in the sense of providing some structure. And what that produces is a different kind of monk. The first kind of monks are off by themselves. The next kind of monk that shows up are Cenobitic monks. Those are monks who live in cells, and cells are rooms in a community. So Cenobitic monks decide that, in a sense, are finding that structure gives them something. That being in a community is a way to discipline themselves, get closer to God, but also do it with the cooperation and for the benefit of a larger community, not just for themselves. And in Egypt, we see this by the 350. So Christianity becomes legal in 313. In Egypt, by 350, we already see monasteries being set up for communities of people that want to separate themselves off from the world in this particular way. So St. Anthony is one of the first to set up a community like this. St. Anthony's monastery dates back to about 350. So this is the one that was founded 1,650 years ago. These monks also find that as they're living in communities, they need a structure. They set up monastic rules, policies to govern themselves, to suggest how it is that they're supposed to live in community, serve God, and sort of work as a community for the good of all. And those monastic rules often still survive. The monasteries tend to run by rules, these ways of governing themselves, that date back thousands of years, oftentimes as far back as to almost as to St. Anthony's itself. So let me just recap where we've been so far. So we start off with the Roman and Greek context in the ancient world and ancient Judaism. The appearance of Christianity, of Jesus coming into the world with a mission, and then the growth of that church. Now that church grows inside a Roman Empire that gives it advantages, but also persecutes it. Emperor Constantine, though, makes that faith legal, and so now the church has an opportunity to reach everybody in the Roman Empire, and Christianity becomes the universal faith of the Roman Empire. But the question then is, well, what happens to that church if the Roman Empire goes away? The Roman Empire is not going to last forever. And so the church that's grown up inside the Roman Empire, first is illegal and then is legal, is now going to have to deal with the problems of when that Roman Empire is no longer there. So that's the big thing that we're going to deal with next time, is the implications of no more Roman Empire and the church having to deal with what happens then. Okay, so that's it for tonight. Let me just see if there's any questions on anything before we go our separate ways for the next week. Going once. Everybody wants to get on the road, I can tell. Going twice. All right, thank you very much for your attention. I will